problems are mainly with the Secretary of State's office not providing adequate training, for instance. I have some concerns about, we have county clerks who are pretty new. We have a handful of them, and I will tell you that most of the clerks in the state, I've known them for years. These people are experts. They know how to do their job, and they do a great job at it. But we have county clerks now that are new county clerks, about 5 or 6 of those. And I know that at least one in the northern part of the state has had problems because everybody in his office is pretty much brand new. And the leadership and the support they're getting from the Secretary of State has just not been there. So the Secretary of State, as you all know, is the Chief Elections Officer responsible for the oversight of the conduct of the elections. The actual conduct, of course, is performed by the 33 county clerks. But the leadership that comes from the Secretary of State's office is critical to how well those county clerks conduct their elections. And so when you have a new clerk, for instance, as this one that I mentioned, thinking about, he had so many problems because the training that is required under the statute that the Secretary of State provide was not there for him. And so if you just don't know something about the election process, you have to do the best you can. Well, what's happening now is a lot of the county clerks are helping each other and helping the new clerks because they know that it's not, the support is not there, which is where I think probably the biggest problem lies in the office of the Secretary of State. So my position is, if elected on November 2nd, what my hope is to bring about competent, professional, dedicated people who are competent in the election code, not somebody that just fills a position, not just a political hire. I think we need to have in this important office someone who understands the election code from cover to cover, someone who's conducted elections, who has extensive knowledge of elections. We must have that if we're going to provide the service that the county clerks deserve. And so that's one of my biggest goals, is to take care of those problems by bringing these competent professionals into the office. I've been working on this since 1993. When I was first elected to the Senate, one of the first things I said we needed to do was bring about real photo voter ID, which many states have implemented already. We have a number of states who have implemented voter ID and do it well, and it works well. And courts around the country, and even, I think it was Indiana, and even the courts here ruled that the city of Albuquerque, where we have voter ID, that they are not unconstitutional, as many people will have us believe, that it's unconstitutional and people don't have IDs and people don't, for whatever reason. Voter ID, let me just tell you, as I have traveled the state, we've had for many years, secretaries of states have stood opposed to voter ID and said, we don't have voter fraud in New Mexico. And my question is, how do you know we don't have voter fraud if you don't have voter ID? And have you listened to the stories that people are telling? I've had presiding judges who have told me stories in Carlsbad and Cibola County who have said, we have people who know, if they know if their neighbor's going to be out of town. We've had a person who knew that his neighbor wasn't going to come vote, so he went into the polls, gave his neighbor's name and his address, thought he was taking care of, doing a good thing for his neighbor so his neighbor wouldn't lose his vote. Because we don't have voter ID and you can simply show up at a polling place and announce your name and address and you shall be allowed to vote, we don't know who that person really is that signs in and is voting. As we hear the many stories about people who are suggesting that someone allegedly committed voter fraud, there is really no way to bring about the trust and the confidence that people need to have in our system until we implement voter ID, until we know that when you show up at the polling place, they're going to have to see your face and see your picture to know that it is you that is going to vote and not someone in your stead, which should not be happening. And so I think voter ID is critical to bringing back and restoring confidence and trust in our election process. We see time after time the percentages of people turning out to vote is just sad. And when I visit with people, the one thing they say is, my vote won't count. All these other people, all these illegals, they tell me illegals are coming in and voting by the busload. My vote won't count. Every time they vote and they're not eligible voters, it diminishes my vote, which it does. And so in order to bring it back, and in order to get people to have trust in the process, we must institute voter ID. I really believe that. I don't know that there's evidence, but I don't know that we've ever had anyone who was aggressive enough to look into it to find the evidence. What I would like to do when we talk about the issue of voter fraud, again, with always keeping in mind that restoring the trust and confidence of the voters is going to be my number one goal in implementing voter ID and looking at voter fraud. What I think needs to be done, I cannot remember in my lifetime, or since I became involved in working in the county clerk's office in 1979, I don't ever remember having a Secretary of State that is the chief elections officer responsible for conduct of elections that has been aggressive at looking at voter fraud, that has been someone who has said, if you have an allegation, send it to me and we will investigate it. So what I'd like to do, and not at a cost to the taxpayers of hundreds of thousands of dollars or a new bureaucratic division or more FTEs or anything, I think it can be done if we bring professionals, dedicated, competent people who know the election code, who understand it, who have been involved in it. If we bring knowledgeable people like that in there, we can have 2 or 3 investigators, if you want to call them that. I always say an investigative arm of the department somehow. For lack of a better phrase, I call it an investigative arm. Someone who, if you send an allegation and you write me a letter and say, this happened at my polling place, I believe this could be voter fraud, I don't care how small that allegation is, I think it should be thoroughly investigated, and find out, was it just a poll worker error, was it a human error that happened at the polling place, and rule it out and say, no, it's not voter fraud, this is exactly what happened. Or investigate it enough to get to the point that, yes, this looks like it could be voter fraud. This is someone who is not a citizen, or someone who just registered, or someone who went to his, as I said earlier, either his neighbor's son was off at college, so he decided to go sign in his neighbor's son. And if there's a way to see that truly is happening, it's a responsibility, I believe, of the Secretary of State, along with the county clerks, to turn that information over to either the district attorney or the attorney general and have it thoroughly investigated and prosecuted if need be. Well, I don't see it so much as adding security. I think we have some concerns. I have voted against same-day registration simply because we still haven't gotten a handle on regular voter registration in this state. You know, we had an issue 3 or 4 months ago with this Secretary of State, the current administration, where there were hundreds of voter registration forms found sitting in the office of the Secretary of State from 2008 that had never been sent to the county clerks and therefore never processed. It was on one of the TV news stations, and they talked about how there were hundreds from all various counties that these people had registered before the general election in 2008. One lady in particular went to go to the polls in the general, was turned away and told she wasn't registered to vote. She even filed a letter of complaint with the AG, with the Secretary of State, and the Santa Fe County Clerk saying, I know I registered to vote. Something happened to my registration. 2 years later, in 2010, this lady finds out that hers was one of hundreds that were never processed because the Secretary of State never sent those registrations to the county clerk, so they were never processed. If we can't get a handle on registration as we have it now, then we have a problem. And I think same-day registration, we would not be able to get a handle on that as well. In addition, the systems that we're using now, when we talk about same-day registration, there's an interface problem with the systems, the 2 different systems that we use. We have the Power Profile, which is what the county clerks use to enter the voter registrations when we register to vote, and we have a ES&S system that they use on election day. Those don't interface. So very easily, here we're talking about voter fraud. You could have somebody driving over where I live in Otero County, and we have Chaparral right there, the Texas border is there. They could drive over into Oro Grande, Chaparral, anywhere there, Cienega, which is right on the border, and they could register right there, and they could vote, and then they could go just 30 minutes down the road, and they're in El Paso, and they could go to Texas and vote again over there. How do we get a handle on something like that? It simply makes it easier for someone to cross a state line, vote in our state, and then cross again and vote in another state. And even with the system we have now, that happens in Dianna County. And I think the guy was the county commissioner, so he voted twice. But I don't think that we have enough of a handle on the voter registration system in place now, or enough of an idea how we would handle these types of situations yet. So we are not there yet, so I would not support same-day registration.